Hello, welcome to the Soldiers and Sailors Monument podcast. My name is Greg Palumbo. I'm the executive director of the Cuyahoga County Soldiers and Sailors Monument. And with me today is author and historian Gene Schmiel, who's written over about 30 books on the Civil War. Most of them you can find on Amazon, so please do check them out. But two of them are about Jacob Cox. We have talked before on this podcast about Jacob Cox and his meaning to the monument, as well as we're going to go a little bit more in depth here, particularly on why that depiction of Cox is the way it is, and he's there with McClellan and their interaction, and a little bit more about why our architect and sculptor Levi T. Schofield may have made the choices that he made. To help us speculate and pull together some of those threads is Gene Schmiel. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. Again, as a native Clevelander, we remember driving by and around and visiting the Soldiers and Sailors Monument a few dozen times in my youth, and it remains today really the symbol of the city.
We appreciate that. Sometimes we become the background, and people don't know that you can come inside. So hopefully, viewers have been into the monument. If not, please do come down. We're open 10 to 5:30 daily. And in the monument, you see four reliefs. And they go from our local perspective of the ladies of the Sanitary Commission and Soldiers Aid Society. We have the state perspective with our three wartime governors, as well as generals that were over Ohio troops. And then on the north side of the reliefs on the interior, we see the Emancipation Proclamation through that sculpture of Abraham Lincoln arming a man of color who is formerly enslaved. We are going to go back to that depiction of our state representatives, the three wartime governors, and Denison, Todd, and Bruff. And then on either side, you have those generals. You have two of them who would become president, and they get a lot of attention. Rutherford B. Hayes on the right-hand side, and on the far left, James A. Garfield. But next to James A. Garfield is J.D. Cox, as well as McClellan. They are locked in a discussion where Cox is pointing at a piece of paper that McClellan's holding. And it has always been a wonder as to why that is. Why do we have them in that discussion? What might that discussion be about? And you have some opinions on why that may be.
Well, I have many opinions. Shall I get into kind of a background of who Jacob Cox was, or do all the viewers know?
No, we should probably give them a little bit of a background. Before that, though, maybe we should get into a little bit of background about you.
Okay.
You mentioned that you're a native Clevelander. I know
Right,
that you went to St. Ignatius.
right. Born and raised, our first house, we were raised in the Tremont area. First place I lived was on West 10th Street, and then we moved to West 7th Street, and I went to St. John Cantius grade school, which is right in the Tremont neighborhood, and then went to St. Ignatius in high school. Then I went to St. Francis College of Pennsylvania, majored in history, and this was all long before most of your viewers were born. I recognize that. And then while I was at St. Francis, the Ohio State University was nice enough to also offer me a fellowship for graduate study. So I went to Ohio State and had two very wonderful experiences there. In December 1969, got my PhD in history. And in January 67, met my future wife, who was a undergraduate at Ohio State, and we got married in 1969. So we recently celebrated our 55th anniversary, and yes, I'm that old. After getting my PhD, I was just 25 years old. Taught at St. Francis for 4 years at St. Francis College, Pennsylvania. Then I joined the Foreign Service. I was a diplomat for 24 years, served 3 tours in Africa, 2 tours in Europe, in the State Department also. I was the acting ambassador, not the ambassador, but acting ambassador of 3 different countries for a total of 2 years. And I retired from the State Department, my God, 28 years ago. But I still work part-time at the State Department, doing a variety of things. They seem to think I have some expertise left, so that's good to know. So we lived around the world. Our daughter was born in Stockholm, Sweden, and our son was born in the exotic city of Altoona, Pennsylvania. And they live. I now live in Gainesville, Virginia, which is just outside Washington. And our children live nearby. We have 5 grandsons, and they're now going to college. So I work at the State Department part-time. I do a lot of writing about the Civil War, lecturing, and generally try to keep out of trouble. So there's my background.
Excellent. Well, we really appreciate you coming back around to Cleveland from time to time and having some interest in your hometown.
Well, I still have a few relatives. My mother was one of 11 children, so I have several cousins living in the Cleveland area. So that brings me back, but also speaking to groups like the Cleveland Civil War Roundtable, the James Garfield House. I've spoken there a few times, and others.
Wonderful. Well, the last time you were up, you came through the monument, and we had this discussion about what that might mean with Cox and McClellan's discussion. Why don't we go back to a little bit of a background on Cox?
Well, as I said, when I was at Ohio State, one of the when you're a graduate student, you have to choose what's going to be a topic of your doctoral dissertation. And one day I was discussing with my advisor, and I said, there's an interesting person, is Jacob Cox, Civil War general, governor of Ohio after the war. He was the president of the University of Cincinnati, dean of the Cincinnati Law School, and his papers are at Oberlin College. And I said, what about if I write a biography of Jacob Cox as my doctoral dissertation? And he agreed. And so from December 68 until June 69, I spent a lot of time in Oberlin researching Jacob Cox, reading his letters to him and others, wrote my dissertation and got my degree, as I said, in December 1969. 2010, after I retired from the Foreign Service and doing other things, I said to myself that I think I should turn that dissertation into a biography, because there was no biography of Jacob Cox. So I went back to Oberlin, did some more research, and in 2014, the Ohio University Press, not Ohio State, Ohio University Press, published this book, Citizen General, Jacob Dolson Cox in the Civil War Era. And I titled it that way because Citizen General, because Cox was not a military man. He did not go to West Point, but he became a very respected general, essentially learning on-the-job training, a political general, but I called it Citizen General. And afterwards, he wrote 5 books about the Civil War, book reviews, etc. So he's one of the major figures, not from West Point. And then while I was doing my research, the archivist, Ken Grossi, thanks, Ken, said that they had gotten a cache of letters from the family in 1996, which I had, of course, not seen. 200 letters that Cox had written home, many of which I'd never seen. So they got me a typescript, and in 2013, I did a second book, My Dearest Lilla. Lilla was the nickname of Cox's wife. Her name was Helen. Letters home from Civil War General Jacob D. Cox. using the letters essentially as a way to look how a person with no military experience adapted to starting the war as a general. So he started right at the top and was a great success as a general. Got to know everybody, um, and um, and so the letters illustrate. So the University of Tennessee Press published that in 2023. So those are the two books about Cox. And so he and I have been together since 1968, back and forth, writing books about him, letters about him, and other things. So that's that background. So that's why when I visited, as I have a couple of times, but most recently, as I said, last summer, when my wife, Catherine, was going to her high school reunion at Orange High School. She's also from the Cleveland area. We went to the monument, and I began talking there with one of your staff people about one of the interesting parts of this panel, the bas-relief, where Jacob Cox and George McClellan are together, with Garfield looking over Cox's shoulder, and Cox is looking down upon McClellan. Again, Cox was 6 foot tall, McClellan was about 5'6", so he looked down on him, pointing with two fingers at this document in McClellan's hand. What did Levi Schofield, why did he do this? Again, at the time, I knew Levi Schofield, in fact, again, born and raised in Cleveland, was Jacob Cox's military engineer on his staff. I think Schofield was, I think, 24 years old at the time. Cox was 36, 37 in the last year and a half of the war. And they got to know one another, very, very good friends. And I said, well, obviously Schofield designed this for a particular reason. And I said, so what papers do you have explaining this? And the answer was, Greg,
We don't have any.
we don't have it. So they said, oh, really? Oh, okay. Well, let me think about this. That's too bad because, again, Schofield was given carte blanche to design the monument any way he wanted, to put people there. He obviously put Cox in a central position, put him next to McClellan, who's not an Ohioan, but did command the first commander of Ohio's troops. And I said, I wonder, I think maybe I know why, but it's pure speculation. I have no documentation. I do have correspondence that's at Oberlin College between Schofield and Cox. No reference to this whatsoever. So I began to think, and I had a discussion with you, Greg, and mainly by email, but others, and I said, I think I'm going to think this through, maybe write down some thoughts about why did this happen? Pure speculation, but reasoned speculation. Some would say an educated guess. It's not a guess, it's an educated speculation. I think speculation is stronger than guess about why this was done. So that's the background of this particular issue.
Yeah, we can only speculate because we don't have anything from Schofield on why he made the decisions he made. He seems to have done some interviews early on in the process of building the monument and talks about elements here and there. And then it started to become very much about Schofield, and they were calling it Schofield's Monument. And that's kind of when he starts to clam up, and we don't hear from him again about his decision-making process and things like that. And that was mainly when the only public view of the monument was exterior. So on the interior, we have scant, recordings from Gleason, the first president of the monument, really just a description of what Schofield had done and not understanding of why he had done what he'd done. So I think we've covered that this is all speculation based on facts that we've been able to find, other documents we've been able to find, but this is to the best of our ability at the moment, and hopefully we're able to uncover more as time goes on. But that being said, what was the relationship between Schofield and Cox? There is a working relationship in that last year and a half. And you say that they're friends. Cox had a son that Schofield was pretty close with. Is that correct?
They were pretty close in age. Yet, Jacob Cox III was a Cleveland industrialist. He created the Cleveland Twist Drill Company, and they had Schofield got a contract to design one of their buildings. So they knew it. I mean, and each of them had a house on Millionaires Row on Euclid Avenue. So Cox's son and Schofield were contemporaries to a certain extent. But I think the relationship between Schofield would have seen Cox as an elder, well, all 36 years old, 37 years old. But again, you're a general when you're 33 to start the war. That's not bad. But he would have seen him as a kind of a semi-father figure, and but he came to know his son. They were industrialists, community leaders at the same time.
So Schofield, very irreverent of Jacob Cox, and we see that in some of his letters. And you shared with me a letter from 1889 where they have a discussion about the Battle of Franklin, what happened during that battle, and then eventually becoming historians of that
Right,
battle, and the differing opinions of who was in charge of what and how and
right.
why.
At Franklin, uh, again, it was a Union victory, and everybody wanted to take credit. Who was more important? Who wasn't even there, but said they were there? Who was? What were they doing? And so Schofield's role at the Battle of Franklin, I don't know if we need a lot of background into how that all happened. That campaign, it was the last great battle of Franklin and then Nashville, in which the Army of Tennessee, the Confederate Army of Tennessee, was obliterated, destroyed. Was the only at Nashville, the only battle in which a one army just totally disintegrated. No other battle did that happen. But the foundation for that was at Franklin. John Schofield, not related to Levi Schofield, West Point, he was in the command of the Union troops who were going north to Nashville, and they were stopped at Franklin because they didn't have pontoons to get across the river. So they had to fight the battle at Franklin. Schofield, who was trained at West Point, and West Pointers were focused on military engineering, he took up the job of supervising the rebuilding of the bridges and the pontoons over the Harpeth River north of Franklin. And he said to Cox, "You will be in charge of the defensive line against John Bell Hood's Army of Tennessee, who may try to attack us." And of course, Levi Schofield, as a military engineer, he would have been one of those helping to set up, reinforce the defensive line against the Confederate attack. The Confederates attack, they almost break through. Various and sundry people helped to save the day, including Cox. And eventually at 7 p.m., the attack at 4 p.m., this is November 30th, sunset at 4:35, dark at 5:15. They're fighting in the dark. This is not done in the Civil War. Again, they're attacking one another in the dark. There are no street lights. There might be a lamp or two in a house, but all the people in the houses in town are either gone or in their basements. It's just pitch black. But it's clear by 7 p.m. that the Union is going to win and that the Confederate attack is going to be beaten back. By then, all the bridges had been built. Orders have come from George Thomas, who was in Nashville. Continue your withdrawal. We have the defenses of Nashville, which have been there for several years since the Union took over Nashville. And so Cox is ordered a little after 7 o'clock. Okay, you've done a great job. Get your troops ready, evacuate. And Cox, at that moment, has, I wouldn't call it an epiphany. He has a memory. This is, again, this is my speculation. 2 years before, Jacob Cox, again, citizen general, not West Pointer, was commanding the left flank of the Union Army at the major battle of Antietam. It's a very, very long story how that happened, but to some extent by accident. Now, he had known George McClellan from the beginning of the war. McClellan was Ohio's commander in the beginning. Cox was in the Ohio Senate, but they worked together to prepare Ohio. So McClellan, who was commander in it, knew Cox, and so he was confident. At a key moment at Antietam, Cox was on the verge of essentially destroying Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. That was in the afternoon of September 17, 1862. Earlier that day, he had gotten orders from McClellan saying, when you cross the bridge, when you're on the move, we will send you reinforcements. Cox asked for the reinforcements. McClellan did not send the reinforcements. Cox was hit from the left. They had to retreat. So at that key moment, with a few reinforcements, Cox wrote in his books, we would have essentially destroyed Robert E. Lee, and Robert E. Lee would have been a prisoner of war. And the nature, and more than a few historians agree with that. That was a critical moment. So that's the backstory. So I'm saying at 7 o'clock, when Cox gets these orders to withdraw, he thinks back to, he says, wait a minute. If we had stayed at Antietam, we would have destroyed. And he said, in my judgment, the Army of Tennessee is in desperate straits. We have thousands of prisoners. We've lost about we have 100 dead. They have over 1,000 dead. They're in if we stay another day, we can destroy the Army of Tennessee. Please, General Schofield, again, that's John Schofield, not Levi Schofield, let us stay another day. And he sends his brother, Cox sends his brother, Theodore, who is on his staff, to go to make this plea directly to Schofield. Schofield says, I hear you, and that's possible, but I have orders here from George Thomas in Nashville. We've been moving north, and you've done a great thing, but we have to move north. And Cox was a good, he saluted, okay, we move north. On December 2nd, they settle into the defenses of Nashville. The Battle of Nashville begins on December 15th. There's 13 days in between. Why? It's December. Civil War battles are not fought in December, except here. It's snowing, it's sleeting, it's cold. The battlefield is a sheet of ice. So they're not good. Nobody's going to fight. They're not going to do anything. So they have 13 days to get ready. And so I speculated that sometime during this 13 days, maybe at dinner one night, Cox, his brother, Schofield, and others on the staff started talking about how much they regretted that they didn't stay at Franklin, that they could have defeated John Bell Hood. And Cox said, as I was doing that, I remembered back at Antietam, we could have done the same thing. If I had been reinforced at that critical moment, in my view, and as we know today, in the view of many historians, if he had been reinforced at that point, Robert E. Lee would have been destroyed. Because the Confederate Army in Sharpsburg, Antietam, they had nowhere to go. There were no bridges over the Potomac River behind them. There was nowhere for them to retreat. They would have been overwhelmed. But McClellan did not send the reinforcements. So my speculation is Levi Schofield creating the monument, remembering how much he thought of Cox as a great general, agreeing with him and Franklin, hearing this story about McClellan, And the order said, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to put these two of them together. I'm going to have Cox standing next to McClellan, having McClellan looking up at Cox. Remember, he's 6 inches shorter, looking up with an embarrassed and a chagrined look on his face, holding in his hand what appears to be either a piece of paper or a book of orders or whatever. One of the things that here's a sidebar. What they had was called a letterpress copybook. When someone would write a letter or an order, the record was kept by this onion skin paper. You put in the order, you pressed it, so the impression came through. I mean, this is one of the things wonderful things out at Oberlin when I was doing my research for Jacob Cox. All of his letters were in these books, one letter after another, and he had good handwriting, so I could read one letter after another. So I think that's what he was holding. Anyway, so what I speculated was Schofield said, I'm going to represent Jacob Cox taking George McClellan to task, pointing to the fact that General McClellan, you promised these reinforcements. You promised me that they would come. And as we now know, if they had come over 3,000 or 4,000 men, we could have won the war right there at Antietam, because the Army of Northern Virginia, Robert E. Lee's men, they had nowhere to go. They were backed up to a river with no bridges. It was a very poor decision to fight there, but McClellan didn't do it. So my speculation was, Schofield said, for all history, Jacob Cox will be showing, essentially castigating George McClellan for his failure to send the reinforcements, and George McClellan looking chagrined. Not Chagrin Falls, that's another story. Looking chagrined, because embarrassed, because he now knows it could have happened. So that's my speculation on why Levi Schofield did what he did. Again, evidence, it's educated speculation. Who knows?
Yeah.
I don't know.
It's not outside the realm though, because we know that Schofield didn't do anything in the monument without a lot of thought put into it.
Wow.
Every detail seems to have a reason. He was very much a student of history and a student of militaria. He was making very educated decisions for everything that he was doing. One of those interesting placements is also General Updike, who's directly above Cox.
Right.
They also had a bit of a contentious relationship. However, they started knowing each other before the war and friendly.
Right. Jacob Cox, I say, he was a student at Oberlin. His wife was the daughter of Charles Finney, the president of Oberlin. But they had and Cox was going to be a minister, a theology professor, very much an intellectual. But they had an argument, and so they moved to Warren, Ohio, where Cox became a lawyer, and Emerson Updike was a local businessman. And so they became very good friends beginning from 1852. And so they knew each other. Updike volunteered, and he rose eventually to the rank of general, but he was, because Cox was politically prominent, he started as a general. Updike really was a colonel and then became a general, but he was in the Army of the Cumberland, the 4th Corps, and Cox was in the 23rd Corps. Anyway, so they weren't really, well, they were on the same camp in the Atlantic campaign. They came to know each other again under Sherman, beginning in early 1864, from Chattanooga down to Atlanta, and then they were together on the Franklin-Nashville campaign. Again, Updike in the 4th Corps, Cox commanding the 23rd Corps. And at Franklin, they came together. they both played a critical role in pushing back the Confederates when the Union was in very dire straits. And after the war, Cox, again, he wrote one book about the Atlantic campaign and Franklin in 1882. He would write another one in 1896. And he corresponded with people like Schofield, like Updike, and even with some Confederate generals about what happened, trying to get his history, because the official records were not really, they began to be published in 1882, 1883. So he didn't have access to all the official records. And what Cox found over time was that Emerson Updike, who did play a very important role, began to believe that he alone, he and his men, were the ones who saved the day at Franklin. That what everybody else was doing was just peripheral. He's the one that did it all himself. And so he and Cox in the 1880s had a lot of back and forth correspondence. And again, they had been good friends for 30 years. And eventually Cox broke off the correspondence. He said, "You are my friend, and yes, you were critically important, but you cannot say that you alone saved the day. This is wrong. This cannot be. And if you continue to hold to that, we cannot correspond anymore." And Updike said, "Yes, that's what I'm holding to." He had a bit of a mental problem. We know there's speculation that he committed suicide. The story was that he was cleaning a gun and went off and he died. Why you're cleaning a gun, pointing at it yourself, I don't know. And these men know about guns.
Right.
Anyway, so Updike wanted full credit. Cox said, "You played your role, so did I, so did Levi Schofield, so did everybody." And I'll even say, I remember Cox wrote in his letter to his wife, which is one of the letters in this second book. He says the word Updike saved the day. He used that. What he meant was at a critical moment. He did, but there were things going on before that moment. And interesting. One of the other fellows who saved the day was a fellow named Arthur MacArthur. Arthur MacArthur was Douglas MacArthur's father. He was wounded at the Battle of Franklin. If he had died at the Battle of Franklin, there wouldn't be no Douglas MacArthur. So there were lots of people there. Again, small world. Yeah. So anyway, I think, as Greg pointed out to me once, there's a medallion of other generals above, and the one of Updike is above Cox on the panel, but facing in the opposite direction. Yeah. And did Schofield do it that way? Because he knew about this back and forth. He knew that friendship had been broken over this. Good speculation. I don't know. And Schofield doesn't tell us. So
yeah,
that's that backstory.
Yeah, very much so. We have a lot of those different connections that just make too much sense to not have been thought of, especially by Schofield, who was involved with all of these people. And in one of the letters you've shared with me from Oberlin, mentions how Updike believes that he was left all alone, and he can understand that because he was still fighting late into the evening, but it wasn't the lone person there, as you say.
And the other, well, I don't know if you were going to mention, but one of the other medallions above Cox is General George Morgan, who was, perhaps by coincidence, Cox's opponent for the gubernatorial election in 1865 for the Democrats. So that too has a relationship with Cox, right?
Very much so. And that's one of those other connections in that panel, and why Cox would be included in that panel, which was how we like to call it's the beginnings of the war, but we like to call it how Ohio won the war, where it has our three wartime governors, and they are very much prominent and centered. But Cox, also political figure, governor, and as you say, Morgan as his opponent. All of that seems to play into that narrative. The odd man out is really McClellan. He didn't necessarily need to be included, but probably because of his prominence in the war, needed to be included in the monument. Opposite this relief on the east side of the pillar, you see Lincoln, Grant, and Sherman, along with a chorus of other generals who were important to the war effort. Uh, McClellan may have been out of taste to put him in the same panel with Lincoln as a general because of their fraught relationship. Maybe Schofield felt he needed to put him somewhere, but as you say, puts him into that diminutive relief where he is looking chagrined and definitely being told how it is
Yeah,
by J.D. Cox.
yeah. I like to tell it by talks that after Antietam, Lincoln was unhappy, and in November 1862, McClellan was replaced by Burnside. And McClellan's orders were to go to Trenton, New Jersey, and await orders. He's still waiting. He sat there for the rest of the war, collected his salary, did absolutely nothing, but ran for president against Lincoln in 1864. And really, a few thousand votes here and there, he would have won. But he was still getting his military salary for doing nothing. So he didn't do anything after November 1862. So there you are. But yeah, he is very much a diminished figure in, and that's obviously intentional too. Again, he was a short guy, but still.
Mm. Important to the Ohio War effort and important to West Virginian history, which
Yes.
is also noted on that side of the monument. We have the Army of West Virginia medallion on the floor in front of that panel, and Ohio's governor at the time sends McClellan to make sure that that West Virginia is protected. So we have that relationship there as well.
And lest we forget, McClellan, who did not like political soldiers, respected Cox enough to give him the command of the troops that went up the Kanawha River Valley. I said Kanawha, not the Kanawha. Kanawha, West Virginia has always corrected me on that one. Kanawha, so Cox's men are the one who took Charleston, the future capital of West Virginia. So Cox is one of the great heroes of the history of West Virginia, pushing the Confederates back. But McClellan respected him enough, an untried soldier, never seen a bullet fly, but gave him that autonomous command. So in that sense, they had a very good relationship. So yes, but Ohio did play a critical role, and Jacob Cox is one of the unsung heroes of the history of West Virginia.
Yeah, so these are all things that play into our panel. We may never know for sure, but I will say I think you've done a masterful job in the speculation of what that conversation may have been about and why those figures were placed together in that consequential panel.
As I say, it's something that struck me, and as I say, so I've begun writing my thoughts, and with Greg and I, can I do it advertising now?
Absolutely.
I've sent Greg a preliminary. It's a lengthy essay at this point, going over all these points. We'll see where it goes, whether it's worth because it's speculation. It's not history, but it's likely history. So maybe publication of some kind somewhere is possible. End of ad.
Well, I will say we are hopeful that it continues and that the speculation continues and more research into these panels. It's a life's work for us at the monument. We are always looking to uncover that next connection, that next thread that we can weave through everything. Coming up soon, we have our dedication of Harvey, the war dog, who is right now sitting across from that panel, but will be prominently placed out into public square He served in the 104th at the Battle of Franklin under Cox, and would be wounded in that battle, but survives and goes on to have a pretty important life himself as a mental health animal for his comfort animal for his owner, Daniel Stearns, of the 104th. So,
I didn't know any of that. Cox doesn't mention it, so that's a very interesting side story too.
yeah, the 104th was right at the front of those battlements that Schofield had engineered. So Harvey would have been right up in the center of that push on the Columbia Pike, facing the enemy in front of the farm there. So we're very proud of that connection and our connection to Franklin, and this really helps to strengthen that relationship to the Battle of
Sure.
Franklin that we have here in Northeast Ohio.
And the folks that battle again, I've been there several times. I've spoken at their Civil War roundtable, and the people at Franklin have done a fantastic job. With no money, no public money, not National Park Service, they've created a huge, that's not an apparatus, several buildings that they bought, building, essentially recreating at least part of the battlefield out of whole cloth because nothing had been done. There were two pizza parlors. I mean, that was the critical part of the whole battle. Nobody can get pizza anymore. It's all gone. But the people at Franklin, so associated with them, finally, Eric Jacobson, I presume you've been in touch with him.
Hmm.
He's been the executive director for 20 years there, I think, something like that. And he wrote a book about the Battle of Franklin, which is superb history. So yes, very, very important.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you very much for joining me today. I hope that everyone that's listening to this will go out and take a look at your immense catalog of histories on the Civil War. Look for that one coming out about the Cox-McClellan relationship in the monument. We'll see how that goes. And definitely, your two books on Cox are excellent. Citizen General is one that I've gone back to several times. So I really appreciate you joining us today. Those that would like to see the monument and see this relief in person, we are open 10 to 5:30 every day of the year. We only close for a couple of major holidays and Browns home games. So don't come down for a Browns home game. It gets a little messy downtown, but
And maybe they'll win a few games soon.
maybe we'll hope. So, any last words you'd like to say on the subject?
No, just thank you for this opportunity, and one of the other things about, I don't know if you focused on this, TNT every year before Christmas shows the Christmas story, and when it begins, they're downtown at Higbee's at the toy store, and the monument is in the back. Have you ever you remember this, don't you?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah, we get a lot of
and
people that come to take pictures because of that.
just because of this Christmas story, and then they go out to Clark Avenue and go visit the house. But yes, that's an interesting part of that whole thing. Oh wow, look at that! There's the monument. So no, thank you again, and hope we can work together. I will be back in Cleveland someday again. I think I probably have a reunion or two left in me at St. Ignatius. And I'm giving a talk later this year, one in Columbus, one in Zanesville. So I would like to come up to the city, visit relatives, and we'll stop in and maybe give a
Fantastic.
talk and maybe give a talk somewhere.
Sounds good.
I'm
Uh,
ready.
those that are watching this, if there's a talk coming up, we'll be sure to push this out again. So hopefully you can check our website. That's soldiersandsailors.com, where you can get all of that kind of information. Keep a lookout for us in the new Superman movie coming out this summer. We play a prominent role in that as well,
Wonderful.
as a background character, as the monument. And as always, thank you very much to Gene Schmiel for joining us today, and thank you. and we'll see you next time.